Hey guys, JDR Exospace here, and I just want to apologize in advance. This is not going to be one of my usual highly polished edited videos, but the content of what I'm about to talk about doesn't need to be edited. This is mind-blowing, groundbreaking stuff. This is like a bombshell revelation when it comes to evidence of aliens and UFOs. If it's real, I just want to make that caveat. If it's real, okay? So I found this post. Joe Rogan tweeted about it. He said, I think there were rabbits in these holes. And I saw aliens and I was like, okay, I'll bite. So I clicked on the article and what I read, absolutely mind-blowing, okay? This is an anonymous post. The original post, the OP, has since been deleted. And it sounds like Reddit was shadow banning his post and the OP has since deleted everything. So they've archived it. And I'm just going to, without further preamble, I'm just going to start reading this because it's really some crazy stuff, okay? From the late 2000s to mid-2010s, I worked as a molecular biologist for a national security contractor in a program to study ex-biospheric organisms, or EBO. I'll share with you a lot of information on this subject. Feel free to ask questions or ask for clarification. And again, this is where he confirms it seems like all my comments are being deleted. So at the end, he posts a few questions that didn't get deleted. And I'm not going to read all of this because this is super technical. But some of this I'm just going to read because it's just wild stuff, okay? From the late 2000s to mid-2010s, I worked as a molecular biologist for a national security contractor. The aim of the program was to elucidate the genome and proteome basis of these organisms. Although the study of OBCs has been going on for decades in other programs, the new high-throughput DNA sequencing technologies of the late 90s unblocked stagnant research in this area. Since then, several breakthroughs have led to significant advances in our understanding of the genome and proteome of these beings. What we've learned so far has enabled us to outline some disconcerting perspectives about our place in the universe. Briefly, we've discovered that the EBO genome is a chimera of genomes from our biosphere and from an unknown one. They are artificial, ephemeral, and disposable organisms created for a purpose that still partially eludes us. They've sequenced the genome of these organisms in a chimera, meaning a combination of different organisms from our biosphere and somewhere else, okay? That's already groundbreaking stuff. Now, before I go any further into this, I just want to address the skepticism that a lot of you probably have. This is a Reddit thread, okay, on an aliens channel. Look, just bear with me on this, okay? So just a little background. I have a master's degree in environmental science, so I'm not a molecular biologist, but I have enough of a science background to understand that this is not a LARP. This is not somebody who just is sitting in their basement with no background in science or biology who's just making this stuff up, okay? This is somebody who definitely has training, education background, and the semantics of the way that he's talking, you can't fake stuff like that. I mean, I've read enough scientific journals. I've talked to scientists, PhDs. You don't speak like this without training and the education in this field, okay? So just bear with me here. But essentially, he describes completing his PhD in molecular biology. He said he didn't actively seek to be part of this program. Rather, it's just a stroke of luck that he met one of the senior scientists in the program. He met them at a conference when he was presenting a poster on his PhD research. And then shortly afterwards, he graduated, received a call from this person offering me a position. Then he describes a series of 3 increasingly suspicious interviews, each in a different location where his scientific background and knowledge became less and less relevant. The first was with 2 of the senior scientists, the second and third with people he's never seen again and who are obviously not interested in science. Sometime after the interview, I was asked to go to a 4th location where what seemed like a corporate lawyer presented me with an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. He made sure not to only explain every detail, but also that I understood the consequence of not respecting it. Which again, probably a big part of the reason why he's coming forward anonymously. If you sign an NDA with the government, the federal government, it's basically top secret disclosures that he's talking about right now. If this is real, significant prison time. He hasn't come forward under the Whistleblower Act. This is an anonymous post on a Reddit thread. Who knows the veracity of it? But once I get into the biology that he's talking about, mind blown. Okay, trust me. The laboratory itself is located in Fort Detrick, Maryland, in a building used for legitimate biomedical research. The clandestine operations are carried out in a restricted part of the basement, out of sight from regular workers. Contrary to what one might imagine, the biosafety level is not maximal for this type of research. Indeed, the lab containing EBO samples or derived cell cultures is BSL-3, while the lab where assays are conducted are only BSL-2. The BSL-3 area of the facility includes a freezer room and a cell culture lab and is only accessible through an antechamber from the BSL-2 section. EBO carcasses are preserved in horizontal freezers at a temperature of -80 Celsius nominal. To maximize the preservation of these carcasses, they are preserved in vacuum bags, and the air in the room is controlled to minimize humidity. There are only 4 bodies, and none of them are complete. It's obvious that these creatures have died as a result of major trauma. I've never witnessed a motorcycle accident fatality, but it probably looks similar to this. It is acknowledged that there are more EBO carcasses at other locations. Other than the labs, there are all the amenities you can find in an office. Note that the internet access is limited to senior staff and up. There is, however, an intranet for bioinformatics needs. So basically they have access to be able to talk to each other, but no access to the outside world. It's in a basement in a surprisingly not that restricted environment with regards to security, but it's at Fort Detrick in a massive government facility. So there's more security than he's letting on at this individual lab. But what he's talking about with BSL-2, BSL-3 is really the, not necessarily security with armed guards sitting outside, more about like the lab safety measurements. So think like the Wuhan lab and like how at this point it's likely that COVID came from a lab. That's the type of safety that he's talking about here. All right, so this is really where he gets into the juicy stuff, okay? On the subject of biology of these beings, I'll start by discussing genetics, then their gross anatomy, and finally, their biological systems. For the sake of clarity, the information I provide here is an aggregation of what I have observed and what I have read. I will make many comparisons with human anatomy because it's the most logical reference. All right, real quick, before I go into this, a lot of this is super technical. It's even above my level, and that's how I know that this guy is not just making stuff up, because it's way too advanced for somebody who's just role-playing here, okay? This is somebody who is well-trained in this. When he says he has a PhD, look, I can't confirm any of this stuff, but just the semantics and the things he's describing, it's the real deal, okay? It really seems that way. Okay, first, I'd like to discuss their genetics. Their genetics are like ours, based on DNA. This fact was very puzzling for me when I first learned about it. We imagine that beings from an alternate biosphere would have genetics based on a completely foreign biochemical system, and surprisingly, this is not the case. Several conclusions can be drawn from this surprising revelation. The one that immediately comes to mind is that our biosphere and theirs share a common ancestry. They're eukaryotes, which means their cells have nuclei containing genetic material, which suggests that their biosphere would have been separated from ours sometime after the appearance of this type of organism. The term exobiospheric organism is actually a misnomer, but as it's a historical term, it's still used. Their genetics are not only based on the same genetic system, but they're also even compatible with our own cellular machinery. This means that you can take a human gene and insert it into an EBO cell, and that gene will be translated into protein, and this of course works in reverse with a human gene inserted into an EBO cell. There are important differences in post-translational modifications that will make the final protein non-functional, but I'll discuss these later. Their genome consists of 16 circular chromosomes. Okay, let's break down just what he's talking about here with the genetics. What he is talking about is that they have the same DNA structure as every other life form on Earth. And not just that, but the implication is that if this did not originate from Earth, the DNA structure didn't either. Okay? That means that life originated somewhere else in the universe, and we are basically one branch of the evolutionary tree here on Earth. The original ancestor, wherever DNA came from, it didn't originate from Earth. Okay, that's what he's basically saying here. He's also saying they only have 16 chromosomes, so they're not human. He's going to go into the detail of the chromosomes and the DNA structure a little bit better here, but that 16 chromosomes is important. Humans have 23 chromosomes, mostly filled with junk DNA sequences. Whatever these aliens are, have 16. That's important. You're probably familiar with the concept of intergenic region or junk DNA. These are basically DNA sequences that don't code for proteins. These are evolutionary residues, transposons, inactivated genes, and so on. To give you an idea, in humans, intergenic regions represent approximately 99% of our genome, meaning these regions that don't really code for anything, vast majority of our DNA, junk. What's particularly striking about the EBO genome is the uniformity of these intergenic regions. We see the same sequences repeated everywhere, and the distance in BP between the genes is virtually the same throughout their genome. The result is a minimalist, highly condensed genome. In fact, it's much smaller than ours. Moreover, the quantity of protein-coding genes is even significantly lower than ours, probably due to genetic refinement, but also to biological processes that are absent in EBO. The uniformity of these sequences is a major indication of the artificiality of these beings. There's no complex organism on Earth that has such elegance in its sequences. There is no evolutionary pressure that can lead to this kind of characteristic other than genetic engineering. Again, what he's saying here, the genetic sequences here are so, for lack of a better word, pure, so absent, that the junk DNA that composes the majority of our DNA that evolved here on Earth, not present here. So that means there's only 16 chromosomes, but the genetic structures that are present, they don't have these useless sequences. It's actually, he goes on to describe, it's almost kind of poetic. Here we go. Speaking of genetic engineering, following sequencing of their genomes, we notice a troubling and universal characteristic in the 5'. Okay, this is where it even gets into beyond my knowledge of genetics and DNA. The TPR are 134 BP sequences containing, as its name suggests, 3 palindromes. Okay. In genetics, a palindrome is a DNA sequence that, when read in the same direction, given the same sequence on both DNA strands. So kind of like the word race car, when you say it, you can say it backwards and forwards. It's spelled exactly the same. It's race car. R-A-C-E-C-A-R, race car. What he's saying is that the sequences of DNA are exactly the same, reading backwards and forwards in a sequence. That's very rare in nature. And to have 3 of them in the same DNA sequence, virtually impossible, right? You would only see that with deliberate genetic manipulation. Okay, so I'm not even going to read some of the stuff that he talks about genetics here because honestly, like I said, it's just beyond my level. But here he says, to my knowledge, only one individual genome has been sequenced. I can't make a definitive statement on genetic variation between individuals. There's also many genes which are not found in our biosphere whose role has not been identified. Finding the purpose of these novel genes is one of the aims of the program. I'd like to note before going any further that this heterogeneity of genes of known and unknown origin is an undeniable proof of the artificiality of EBOs. To conclude with genetics, the mitochondrial genome at the time I was working there had not yet been sequenced. It's safe to assume that this genome would also be streamlined and possibly has some version of TPR. So again, what he's saying here, he worked in the early 2000s, 2010s for less than a decade. It's 2023 now. Been a decade since he worked here. Imagine how vastly improved our ability to DNA sequences as opposed to early 2010s. The information he's bringing forward is over a decade old. Who knows what they've unlocked since? Wild stuff. But we're not even into the juiciest bits yet. Okay, this is where I'm gonna skip down a little bit, and we're gonna start talking about the morphology of these creatures and what they actually look like. Okay, gross anatomy. They are morphologically very similar to the gray aliens that are part of modern folklore. Their height is about 150 centimeters. They have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. Still, there are some notable differences. The gray skin that is often described in folklore is in fact a biosynthetic film which likely serves to protect the EBO from a hostile environment. It doesn't provide effective protection against temperature changes, but it does offer adequate protection against the passage of liquids. It's possible that this film confers other advantages, but my knowledge on the subject is limited. Under the gray film, the epidermis is rather white, and the texture is very regular and without hair, suggesting it's probably not mammalian. We do not see any defect other than the folds near the joints. It's described as greasy in one report, but that's not something he's personally observed. The same report states that a strong, lingering smell of burnt hair and ammonia is present when the film is removed. There's a lot of pores on the skin crossing from the epidermis to a gland in the hypodermis, or just beneath the skin. These glands and pores are the terminal part of the excretory sudoriferous system, which could explain the previously mentioned smell. If you have not seen my video on Varginha, Brazil, when you are done with this video, go watch it. The things he is describing right here with the smell of ammonia and the excretory system, it confirms so many things that I've talked about with that story, but so many other things that he's going to get into here that I haven't had a chance to talk about yet on this channel. That overwhelming smell of ammonia, multiple eyewitnesses at the hospital, the people that encountered the crash site, the people that saw the aliens, the girls that saw the aliens in Varginha, Brazil, all of them described an overpowering smell of ammonia. What happens with this ammonia is an excretory system. As you get hot, and as the creature gets hot, and as the creature exerts itself, its excretory system is working harder, and so that smell of ammonia becomes more pronounced. Now, what happens if you were in a craft, for example, and you crashed, and then you were fleeing in southern Brazil, where it's even on a mild September day, it's still pretty warm. Your excretory system, much like how we sweat, is going to be working in overdrive, and that smell of ammonia is going to get more pronounced. Wild stuff here, guys. This is confirming so many of the UFO stories we've heard about, Varginha, Brazil in particular, which is one of the most famous cases in Brazil. Again, if you have not watched my video, go watch it after this. The head contains 2 large, oversized eyes, 2 nostrils without protuberance, a narrow mouth without lips, and 2 ear canals without auricles. There is a mandible or a jaw, but the musculature is fastigial. There are no teeth or tongue in the oral cavity. The nasal cavity where the nostrils meet is compact and does not rise cranially, but extends axially. There appears to be no equivalent of the olfactory bulb in the nasal cavity, meaning they don't really have a sense of smell the same way that we do. The mouth leads directly to the esophagus and the nasal cavity to the trachea. The trachea and esophagus do not communicate. So a little bit about human biology here. When you're breathing, when you're talking, your trachea is open, your esophagus is closed. When you swallow, there's a flap that separates your trachea and esophagus. So it's basically the same tube that's connected all the way down your throat. And so when you choke, basically you get food down the trachea when it's supposed to go down the esophagus. So that flap didn't open and close the way it was supposed to. So food went into the trachea rather than the esophagus. He's saying that these are 2 distinct passages, one from the nasal cavity and one from the esophagus. There's no flap. Interesting. Eyes. Like the skin, the eyes are covered with a semi-transparent biosynthetic film that offers the same environmental protection while providing protection against certain wavelengths and light intensity. When the film is removed, a more traditional eye is revealed. It's about 3 times larger than a human eye, and there are no eyelids. The size of their eyes suggests that they have excellent night vision. It seems paradoxical to cover them with a semi-opaque film. Perhaps they only need it to wear in a bright environment. Their sclera is the same color as their skin. The iris is pale gray, and the pupil is black and oversized. The lens is rounder than a human, and the musculature used to adjust focus is more developed. On the retina, there are at least 6 types of cone cells. The responsiveness of each of these 6 types of cones is specific to a wavelength band with a minimum of overlap between each other. The result is a broader visible spectrum, meaning they actually have probably better vision than we do because they can see a broader spectrum of visible light. Very interesting. Ears. As mentioned, the outer ear has no auricle and the ear canal is unremarkable. The inner ear has all the characteristics of a typical vestibular and cochlear system, talking about the inner ear. Although the curvature of the cochlea is more pronounced than a human, this probably results in greater hearing acuity for low frequencies. So their outer ear is not as developed, a really unremarkable ear, but their inner ear is a little bit more developed and they could probably hear better at lower frequencies. So far, all we're hearing confirms a lot of what we've already, a lot of eyewitness accounts of what these things look like. Big eyes, not pronounced ears, not pronounced mouth. What, man, if this is real, this is some crazy, crazy stuff. Neck. Oh, skipped one. The brain. Very important. The brain is tetraspheric, i.e. composed of 4 major sections. The sections are separated by transverse and longitudinal fissures and are connected to the central lobe, which acts as brainstem and cerebellum. The volume of the brain is around 20% superior to that of a man of the same height. It has a much more pronounced level of gyrication than an average human. Moreover, the ratio of glial cells to neurons is also slightly higher than in humans. It is important to mention the presence of nodules on the central lobe. Histological analysis of these structures reveals a kind of intricate biological circuitry It is speculated that these nodules are essential to interact with their technology. Consequently, determining the proteome of these structures is an absolute priority for the program. So again, just to break down what he's talking about here, he's essentially talking about a obviously much more developed Neuralink, like what Elon Musk is describing. But Elon Musk is developing the very first version of it, where you can basically plug a computer chip into your brain. What these guys are, what this whistleblower is talking, if it is indeed a whistleblower, is describing is biological nodules, this sort of fusion of organic and inorganic nodules in the brain that allows them to interact with their technology, probably in what we would think of as telepathy. Why, like I said, wild stuff here. The neck. The neck is proportionately longer than that of a human and at the same time relatively thin. As mentioned, the esophagus and trachea are separate. There are no vocal cords in this region. Thorax. The musculature of the thorax is underdeveloped. Muscles equivalent to the pectoralis major can be seen. We can also see the trapezius and deltoid muscles. Sternocleidomastoids are well defined. The ribs and sternum are clearly visible. There are no nipples. No nipples. Abdomen. The abdomen is wider than the thorax and bulges slightly forward. There is no navel. Pelvis. The pelvic bones are apparent. There are no genitals or anus. 3 of those, no nipples, no navel, no genitals. That describes a creature that does not sexually reproduce in the way that basically everything on Earth sexually reproduces. If there's no nipples, it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't sexually reproduce, but it at least doesn't lactate the same way that all mammals do. There's no navel, so it doesn't have an umbilical cord. And if there's no genitals to speak of, there's no sexually reproducing organ the way that we would think of sexual reproduction. He goes on to describe the anus. There's no anus because the excretory system is, remember, it's using those pores through the skin and excreting ammonia as waste. It's not consuming food the way that we would describe it or the way that we would think of. So there's no excretory system the way that we have. This is insane, man. Their hands have 4 digits, including an opposable thumb on the medial side. They have no nails, and the texture of their fingerprints is composed of concentric circles. Fingers are proportionately much longer than in humans. Unlike humans, finger musculature is entirely intrinsic to the hand. In other words, the muscles used to move the fingers are not in the forearms, but entirely located in the hand. At first glance, the feet consist of just 2 digits, but a necropsy soon determined that each toe is made of 2 fused digits. The medial toe is marginally longer than the distal toe. The feet are relatively longer and narrower than in a human. Their musculature, however, is vestigial. Think about, like, if you have not watched that Varginha video, I beg you to go watch it after this. Military whistleblower X, a guy that claimed to have seen the alien in Varginha, described the feet of the creature as V-shaped, right? This is exactly what it's describing. A feet of just 2 digits. But actually these are 2 fused digits. 2 digits here. So basically 2 toes fused out of 4 original toes into a V-shaped structure, which again, if these are fused digits, it would implicate that this evolved over time to some degree. Even with genetic manipulation, whatever this creature was originally, it experienced evolution just like everything else on this planet did, right? That's the same thing like horses, whales. These are all mammalian or ancestors of an original, or descendants of an original mammalian ancestor. And that's why a hoof has fused foots that make up a hoof, or a whale has fins that are made out of fused, or fins made out of fused digits. Ooh, I'm not even done yet. Okay. Their exoskeleton is similar to ours, at least in terms of composition. Blood cells of the myeloid lineage. Transverse section of the bone reveals osteon and osteocytes. All right, the respiratory system. Their cellular respiration is equivalent to ours. They need to oxidize organic components to produce energy. Their lungs have no reciprocating action, but rather have a unidirectional flow of air, similar to those seen in birds, which is more efficient than ours. So we have this breathing action, in and out, inhale, exhale. These don't have that. It is speculated that this is in response to the brain's elevated metabolic needs. Vocalization is produced by vibration of the wall membrane at the junction between the 2 air sacs. So if they are able to communicate vocally, It's done through essentially a vibration of their lungs rather than vocal cords the way that we do. The circulatory system is rather analogous to ours. The heart is located at the mediastinum, but in a more medial position directly beneath the sternum. The blood itself is also analogous to that of a human. I know it seems like I'm just reading a biology textbook here, but for those of you that are still with me into this video, the reason this is so important is he is describing biology, anatomy, morphology of a creature very similar to humans, but also very different, composed of, to some degree, human DNA with structures very similar to humans, but with clear genetic manipulation. Some of these features are far more efficient than what natural evolution, or what we would think of as natural evolution, has created in humans. Crazy stuff, crazy stuff. Excreto-sudoriferous system. So this is when he gets into the pores and the ammonia-producing skin. This system is completely different from what I've seen. As mentioned earlier, there is no large orifice like an anus or urethra to get rid of biological waste. Instead, there are countless small pores on the surface of the skin. There's a large medial organ called the hepatorenal organ, which acts as both kidney and liver and is central to maintaining homeostasis. This organ is highly vascularized, and the blood must pass through it before returning to the heart. Its role is, among other things, to purify the blood of metabolic waste. Waste is excreted into the equivalent of a ureter, which branches out into 4. Each branch flows towards one of the 4 limbs, and in turn, these branches divide until they end up as thousands of excretory pores. Okay, so essentially what he's saying here is there's a central excretory organ, and it basically sends a branch, 1 to each arm and 1 to each leg, so 4 branches. And then that breaks up into thousands of excretory pores that end up on the skin. So essentially it's excreting its waste, its metabolic waste, through an ammonia concentration, an ammonia-based chemical through the skin, which, I mean, this is connecting all of the dots with some of the best UFO alien encounter eyewitness accounts that we have, and giving the biological explanation for what these people saw. This is really groundbreaking bombshell stuff. I cannot imagine a situation in which someone who doesn't have access to this type of information would be able to make this up, because this literally, unless this is a fantastic fiction writer with a very advanced molecular biology background, this is the real deal, folks. The real deal. Digestive system. The digestive system is extremely underdeveloped. There's no stomach in the familiar sense. However, there is a pseudostomach located at the transition between the thoracic and abdominal cavities. This organ is not involved in digestion, but only serves as a reservoir. A sphincter controls the flow of food into the intestine. The intestine is limited to the equivalent of our small intestine. It only serves to absorb liquids and nutrients and acts as the main digestion site. It has villi and microvilli like ours. The intestine ends in the hepatorenal organ, where non-digested matter is transported to the ureter and excretory system. Residues are dissolved in the ammonia of metabolic waste for excretion. There's an organ near the pseudostomacal sphincter that secretes digestive enzymes directly into the intestine. This organ is inspirationally called the digestive organ. It secretes mainly proteolytic enzymes and glycoside hydrolases. Whoo! This is so much, guys. It really is. So there's no teeth. There's the absence of a true stomach, the absence of defecation. They only consume food in liquid form. Given the high metabolic needs of their brains, their food would have a high carbohydrate concentration. In order to meet other metabolic needs, there must also be a high protein content in the food consumed. Immune system. The immune system is another unknown. There seems to be an innate immune system, but there doesn't seem to be an adaptive immunity, at least not similar to what is known. Some cells have leukocyte characteristics such as granularity. The immune cells that germinate here have a high copper concentration. The surface receptors of innate immune cells have not been characterized, so we might as well say that all the work remains to be done. Nervous system. In short, other than the central nervous system, nothing out of the ordinary. Musculoskeletal system, nothing out of the ordinary. They just have, well, out of the ordinary being the key phrase here. All right, we've made it through his description. Okay, one other thing I want to point out. He answers some questions here, but He lists the Battelle National Biodefense Institute as the place where this research was conducted. Let's look it up on Google Maps. What do we see here? It is real, guys. Let's look at the maps. That is where they are keeping the aliens, right there. Right in the middle of Fort Detrick, Maryland, right outside of Baltimore and Washington, D.C., right by the Capitol, right where all of the national defense contractors and security contractors reside. That's where they're keeping the aliens, right there. Battelle National Biodefense Laboratory in a basement is where the bodies are kept. Guys, I know, thank you for bearing with me for this video as I read what must have been very technical. I mean, even for me, some of that was completely beyond even my background, which leads me to believe that this is not fake. This is somebody definitely with a background in microbiology. And the interesting thing is I'm reading the comments on the Reddit thread. Some of these people have more experience than I do, and they're saying the exact same thing. Awesome read. I've worked in a BSL-3 lab. I can attest that this person at the very least has actual hardcore lab experience. I found nothing questionable in the semantics. When I saw your heading on autoimmunity, I was about to be skeptical about how you could gather very much info from a carcass, and then your response was basically unknown aside from organs, which makes a lot of sense. I'm an entomologist. I understood the text, and I'm utterly fascinated by implications here and also slightly disturbed. The sweat is essentially urine and excrement. There's a lot of scientists in these threads, in these comments, that are saying that this makes a lot of sense. Man, it goes on and on. I have a biology background. I work in a lab, not going to say more. Have an avid interest in genetics. Microbiologists would understand. Anyway, the terminology and precision in this post not only indicate the expertise of the author, but also lend authenticity. Guys, it's really easy to think that this is just a fake and a hoax, but this isn't like a Bigfoot footprint here. This is a guy describing in very complex terms what he has studied in the lab for several years and really confirming and tying together all of the pieces for so many of the eyewitness UFO and alien encounter witnesses. I mean, this connects so many of the dots. If this is fake, consider me a fool. And wow, great hoax. But man, anyway, I just wanted to share this with you guys. I just wanted to, I had to drop everything I was doing today to bring this video to you, so I apologize for the lack of editing, but I'm going to try to get this out as quickly as I can. And I will talk to you guys soon.